The night was alive with the hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and soft jazz playing in the background. Emily Barrett stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes scanning the room, trying to find a way to feel at ease among the wealthy faces that surrounded her. The annual charity gala in Los Angeles was an event she had reluctantly agreed to attend, knowing it was part of the world she was about to enter. She wasn't sure how she felt about it, the lavish surroundings, the elegance, the silent judgments of the people around her. Her thoughts were interrupted when she caught sight of him across the room. Yusef Al-Hadi stood like a statue, tall and imposing, his presence cutting through the crowd. His dark eyes were focused, scanning the room with the intensity of someone who had seen it all. But as his gaze landed on hers, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily felt the weight of it, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw her toward him. He smiled, his expression both inviting and commanding, and for a moment Emily was caught in his gaze. It was as if the noise of the room had faded, and all she could hear was the steady beat of her heart. She wasn't sure what it was about him. Maybe it was the confidence with which he moved, the quiet power he exuded. Or maybe it was the way he held himself, as though he belonged to a different world, one she was both curious about and terrified of. He approached her with measured steps, his eyes never leaving hers. "Emily Barrett, I presume?" His voice was smooth, cultured, impossible to ignore. She blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Yes, that's me," she replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "And you are—" "Yusef Al-Hadi," he said, offering a hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." As she shook his hand, she noticed the strength in his grip, the confidence in his posture. There was something about him that felt almost too perfect, too poised. But at the same time, there was an undeniable allure, something about the way he held her attention without effort. They exchanged pleasantries, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Yusef than met the eye. He wasn't just a businessman. There was a quiet intensity about him that made her feel both intrigued and unsettled. It was clear he was used to getting what he wanted, but there was also an air of mystery, a complexity to him that she couldn't ignore. As the conversation shifted, Yusef leaned in slightly, his tone becoming more serious, more deliberate. "I've heard a great deal about you, Emily. Your work, your passion for teaching, your vision." He paused, letting the words settle. "I must admit I admire people who are unafraid to follow their own path." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was the sincerity in his voice or the weight of his gaze that made her feel so exposed. But there was something about the way he looked at her, as though he could see straight through her, that left her feeling vulnerable, unsure of how to respond. She smiled, trying to keep the conversation light. "I try to make a difference even in the smallest way. I believe in giving back to the community." Yusef nodded, his gaze never wavering. "You're very much like me in that respect," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I believe in using what we have to create something greater, but there is always a cost, isn't there?" His words hung in the air, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The way he said it, almost as if he was speaking from experience, made her wonder what that cost truly was. She had always believed that the pursuit of a meaningful life was worth any sacrifice, but Yusef's words made her question whether she truly understood what she was getting into. Before she could respond, Yusef's expression softened, and he flashed another one of those knowing smiles. "We'll talk more, I'm sure," he said smoothly. "Enjoy the evening, Emily. I have no doubt you'll make a lasting impression tonight." As he walked away, Emily was left standing there, a mixture of fascination and wariness settling in her chest. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was swirling with the encounter. She had met wealthy, successful people before, but there was something about Yusef, something that made her feel like she was stepping into a world that might be more dangerous than she realized. She wasn't sure what it was, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. It had been a few months since Emily first met Yusef, and the whirlwind of his world had swept her off her feet in ways she hadn't expected. The opulent dinners, the private events, the compliments, everything about Yusef made her feel like she was part of a world she didn't belong to, and yet she was captivated. Their relationship had evolved quickly, with Yusef's presence becoming more constant in her life. He was never overbearing, always respectful of her independence, yet there was a quiet intensity that lingered in every conversation, every moment they spent together. It was on a crisp evening, in one of the most luxurious restaurants overlooking the Pacific, where Yusef finally took the step that Emily had been both longing for and dreading. The table was set for two in a private corner, far away from the hustle of the busy dining room. Soft lighting bathed them in a warm glow, and the air was thick with the promise of something monumental. "You look stunning tonight," Yusef said, his voice a smooth whisper that made Emily's heart race. He smiled, and there was an undeniable sincerity behind it, yet a glimmer of something deeper that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, not in this setting, not this way. The grandeur, the luxury, the flawless atmosphere, it all felt like a dream she was afraid to wake up from. Yet there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling of unease, that this world might be more complicated than it seemed. The waiter approached, setting down their plates. Emily's gaze flickered briefly to the surroundings before meeting Yusef's again. He hadn't taken his eyes off her since she'd walked in. It was in those moments when he looked at her that she felt both seen and exposed, like he knew her better than anyone ever had. And yet she was unsure if she truly knew him. He broke the silence between them, his voice suddenly serious. "Emily, I want to share something important with you tonight. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I know it's time." Her pulse quickened as she looked at him, the intensity in his eyes making it hard to breathe. "What is it?" she asked, a mix of curiosity and wariness filling her voice. Yusef reached for a small velvet box tucked in his pocket and placed it gently on the table. "I want you to be my wife," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "I've spent months getting to know you, and in that time, I've realized that you're the one I want to build my life with. I want to share everything I have with you, my world, my future." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the ring, a beautiful emerald set in gold, its deep green hues reflecting the soft candlelight. It felt surreal, too good to be true. A part of her wanted to say yes, to give in to the dream Yusef was offering, but there was a tug at her heart that made her hesitate. She glanced up at him, his face waiting, expectant, vulnerable. "Yusef, He cut her off gently, a reassuring smile spreading across his lips. "Emily, I know this is a big step, but I believe you're the one who can truly understand me. I'm offering you more than just my name. I'm offering you a life built on respect, security, and love. A life where you're free to pursue your dreams alongside mine." His words hung in the air, and Emily felt the weight of them pressed down on her. She had always believed in following her heart, in carving her own path. But with Yusef, the path felt almost too perfect, too easy, like something had already been laid out for her, and all she had to do was walk it. "I've seen the way you live," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Your world is so different from mine. I don't know if I can fit into it if I—" "Emily," Yusef interrupted softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I don't expect you to change, but I want you to be part of something bigger, something that we can create together. You don't have to lose who you are. I'm not asking you to be anyone else but yourself." A chill ran down her spine as she looked at him. He was offering her everything, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like there were strings attached. His words were comforting, but something deep within her cautioned her not to overlook the fine print. The idea of a perfect life, a perfect love, had always felt like a fantasy. And now, as Yusef's proposal hung in the air, Emily couldn't ignore the underlying doubt in her mind. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something raw and genuine, something that made her believe in the possibility of happiness she had never thought possible. The pull was undeniable. "I want to say yes," she whispered, her voice almost a breathless surrender. "But I'm scared. I don't want to lose myself in this." Yusef smiled, his grip tightening ever so slightly around her hand. "You won't lose yourself, Emily, I promise. We'll build something together, something stronger than anything you've ever known." Emily's heart ached as she realized that the choice before her wasn't just about love, it was about her own identity, her autonomy. Could she accept the life Yusef offered without losing herself? Or would she lose her sense of self, her independence in the process? The answer, as she would soon find out, was far more complicated than she could ever have imagined. Emily stood at the large bay window of Yusef's mansion, staring out at the sprawling view of Beverly Hills. The city lights twinkled below, a shimmering sea of possibility. It was beautiful, almost surreal, but the longer she looked at it, the more it felt like a distant world that didn't belong to her. Everything around her, this grand home, the extravagant parties, the constant hum of opulence, was starting to feel suffocating. She had dreamed of a life like this, of course, back when she was struggling to make ends meet. She thought that money, fame, and luxury were the answers to her problems, the things that would fill the emptiness she had felt in her modest life. But now, as she looked out the window, she realized that having it all didn't necessarily bring happiness. Yusef had given her everything. His love, his wealth, his world. And yet the more she lived in it, the more isolated she felt. His family's expectations, his subtle demands, and the unspoken rules of his world were becoming too much. Every day she woke up, feeling like a stranger in a life that was no longer hers. In the beginning it was easy to ignore the signs, to brush off the little things. The casual comments from Yusef's mother, Mariam, about how she should dress, how she should behave. Emily thought it was just part of the adjustment. She was marrying into a family with traditions, after all. But as the days turned into weeks, those little things became harder to ignore. "Emily, we're going to a family dinner tonight. You should wear the dress I bought for you last week," Mariam said, her voice dripping with condescension as she handed her the dress. "It's more appropriate for our gatherings." At first, Emily had tried to argue, to assert her own sense of style, but she quickly learned that pushing back against Mariam's subtle commands wasn't as easy as it seemed. Yusef, though quiet on the matter, never fully supported her when she did. "It's just easier this way," he would say. "You know how my mother is." And so she found herself in the dress, her individuality slipping further and further away. Each moment in this gilded cage felt like another layer of her soul being chipped away. The world she had once thought was so glamorous was now closing in on her, suffocating her with its expectations. One evening after a particularly awkward dinner with Yusef's family, Emily retreated to her room, her head spinning. She needed air. The mansion, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She opened the window, leaning out to feel the cool breeze against her skin, but even that moment of freedom felt fleeting. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She turned to see Yusef standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're upset," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "I'm not upset," Emily replied, trying to sound more composed than she felt, but she couldn't mask the frustration in her voice. "I'm just tired." Yusef stepped closer, his gaze softening. "I know it's not easy, but this is our life now, Emily. You're part of my world now." Emily swallowed, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She had always been independent, carving her own path, and yet here she was, caught in a world that wasn't hers. It wasn't just the dress or the dinners or the never-ending scrutiny from Mariam. It was everything. It was the unspoken rules, the expectations that weighed heavy on her every move. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," Emily admitted, her voice shaking. "I'm trying, but I feel like I'm losing myself." Yusef's face hardened, the tenderness in his eyes fading as he reached out to touch her arm. "You're not losing yourself. You're gaining something far greater than your old life could ever give you. You're gaining security, love, respect." He paused, searching her face. "You have everything now, Emily." But in that moment, Emily realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She might have everything in terms of material wealth, but she had lost something infinitely more valuable, her own sense of self. As Yusef kissed her forehead and left the room, Emily stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the golden cage she had once dreamed of now trapping her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The love she felt for Yusef, the respect she had for him, all of it seemed to hang in the balance. But at what cost? And in that moment, Emily understood that the price of this life, of this world, might be far higher than she was willing to pay. The tension between Emily and the life she had agreed to live with Yusef was growing. It wasn't something that had happened overnight, rather, it was a slow, subtle shift that had crept into her daily routine. Each moment, she found herself further distanced from the woman she once was, the woman who wore what she wanted, spoke her mind, and lived independently. And yet here she was in a life that seemed to be dictating every choice she made. The first sign that Yusef's world came with more than just the glittering promises of luxury and security arrived one rainy Thursday afternoon. Emily was sitting in the library, reading a book she had long neglected, when Yusef walked in with his usual composed demeanor. His tall figure loomed in the doorway, framed by the soft light filtering through the window. His gaze immediately found her, his eyes sharp, scanning her. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." She put the book down, her heart skipping a beat. There was always something in his tone when he said those words, a quiet authority, a sense of control. At first she had found it reassuring, a sign of his confidence, but now it felt like the first stirrings of something more unsettling. "What's on your mind?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but she could feel the knot forming in her stomach. "I've been thinking about how you've been dressing lately," he continued, walking toward her, his movements measured. "It's important that you reflect the image of someone who is part of our world. You represent me, you know." Emily's chest tightened. She had always prided herself on her independence, on wearing what made her feel comfortable and true to herself. But here was Yusef, the man she had married, telling her that her sense of self-expression didn't align with his expectations. "I'm not sure what you mean," Emily replied, her voice slightly defensive. "I dress just fine." Yusef's expression hardened just a fraction. "No, Emily, it's not fine. It's not about just fine. I'm talking about the image you present. We need to make a statement. You are the wife of Yusef al-Hadi now. People will be watching." The weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog. Emily sat there, frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to argue, to stand her ground, but something inside her, a small, quiet voice, reminded her of the promises she had made, of the life she had chosen. It felt like too much to confront all at once. "So what do you suggest?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yusef smiled, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "I think it's time to upgrade your wardrobe. We'll go shopping this weekend. I've already made arrangements. I'll be there to help you choose what's appropriate." Emily's heart sank. She had always valued her independence, her ability to make her own choices, especially when it came to something as personal as her appearance. The idea of having someone else dictate what she should wear felt suffocating. "I don't need help choosing my clothes," she said, her tone more forceful than she intended. Yusef's gaze sharpened. "I don't think you understand, Emily. This is for your own good. It's for our future. You need to trust me." The words stung. It wasn't the first time Yusef had told her to trust him, but each time it felt like a little more of her autonomy slipped through her fingers. She wanted to trust him, she really did, but the more he asked her to change, the more it felt like he was trying to reshape her into something she wasn't. "I don't want to lose myself in all of this," Emily said, her voice barely a murmur. "I don't want to become someone else just to fit in." Yusef's expression softened, but there was something almost patronizing about it. He stepped closer to her, taking her hand gently in his. "You're not losing yourself, Emily, I promise you. This is just a small adjustment, you'll see. You'll be happier once you embrace it." Her heart ached as she looked at him. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the truth was, every small adjustment felt like a step further away from the life she had once known. As Yusef kissed her forehead and left the room, Emily was left in the silence of the library, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep compromising, how much longer she could keep pretending that she was okay with it all. She had promised herself that she would stay true to who she was, but now, as she sat there, the quiet realization settled in. She might not have a choice. Emily stood in front of the full-length mirror, running her fingers through her long hair. The soft strands had always been a part of her identity, untamed, free. Her hair was a reflection of the woman she had been before all of this, before she had stepped into a world where every detail of her life seemed to be meticulously controlled by Yusef and his family. She thought back to the quiet conversation with Yusef the night before, his calm voice echoing in her mind. "I think it's time you cut your hair, Emily. It will make you look more elegant, more refined." At the time, she had tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just one more request, one more small adjustment. She had learned to go along with his demands, believing that it was part of his world, part of the price she had to pay for the life he promised. But as the morning wore on, the weight of his words became unbearable. It wasn't just about the haircut. It was about what it represented, the gradual erasure of the woman she had been, the woman who valued her independence, her ability to make her own choices. Yusef had never explicitly told her to change, but every suggestion, every request, slowly chipped away at her sense of self. It was as if she had become a canvas for his vision of what she should be, a perfect accessory to his ideal life. The sound of the door opening startled her, and she turned to see Yusef standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I've arranged for someone to come in and help you with your hair," he said, his voice calm, detached. "It'll only take a few minutes. I want you to look your best for tonight's dinner." Emily felt a surge of frustration welling up inside her, but she bit her tongue. She had learned long ago that challenging Yusef's decisions wasn't as simple as it seemed. He had a way of making her feel like her objections were insignificant, like her feelings didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. "I can do it myself," Emily said quietly, her voice more resigned than she intended. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to the version of herself that she no longer recognized. Yusef didn't respond immediately. He simply stepped further into the room, his presence looming over her. "You're part of my world now, Emily," he said, his tone gentle, but with an edge she couldn't ignore. "And in my world, we present ourselves in a certain way. It's not just about you, it's about us." His words stung, not just because they were true, but because they were laced with an implication that she had no choice in the matter. This wasn't a request. It was an expectation, a command. Emily's chest tightened. She looked at herself in the mirror once more, the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized, staring back at her. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, the invisible pressure to comply pressing down on her like a heavy stone. "I'll be downstairs when you're done," Yusef said, his voice barely a whisper as he turned and left the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stared at her reflection, unsure of how much longer she could keep pretending. The life she had once dreamed of had turned into something she wasn't sure she could live with. Moments later, the hairdresser arrived, a soft-spoken woman who set up her tools in silence. Emily sat in the chair, her heart racing. She didn't want this. She didn't want to give in, to let Yusef shape her into someone she wasn't. But as the first lock of her hair fell to the floor, she realized that the fight had already been lost. Each snip felt like a piece of herself being cut away. She tried to ignore the sharp sting of betrayal that rose in her chest, but it was impossible. The woman she had been, the woman she still wanted to be, was slowly fading into the past, and she wasn't sure if she could ever get her back. The haircut was finished in silence. Emily stood up, her eyes fixed on the mirror in front of her. Her hair, once long and wild, was now shorter, more controlled, more polished. It was beautiful. She couldn't deny that, but it wasn't her. Yusef's voice echoed in her mind again. "In my world, we present ourselves in a certain way." As she left the room, the weight of her new reality settled on her shoulders. She had hoped that her marriage to Yusef would be a partnership, a meeting of equals. But with each passing day, it was becoming clearer. She was living in his world, and she was losing her place in her own. Emily had always been a woman who trusted her instincts. When something felt off, she could usually pinpoint the source. But now, as she settled into her new life with Yusef, she began to sense a growing unease, a gnawing feeling that something was being kept from her. The gilded cage was beginning to show cracks, and Emily couldn't ignore them any longer. It started with small things, Yusef's strange reluctance to talk about his past. He had shared stories about his business ventures, his family, even his ambitions, but whenever the topic of his previous relationships came up, he quickly changed the subject. At first, she chalked it up to him being a private person, but as time went on, the silence grew louder. One evening, while Yusef was away on a business trip, Emily found herself wandering through the library, her fingers trailing across the spines of books she'd never read. Her eyes landed on a thick, leather-bound photo album sitting on a shelf. Curiosity piqued. She pulled it down, flipping it open. The first pages were filled with pictures of Yusef's family, his mother, his father, his brothers. But as she turned the pages, something caught her eye. A photograph of Yusef with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was beautiful, slender, dark-haired, her eyes shining with an unmistakable warmth as she smiled beside Yusef. They looked like a couple, so natural together, so happy. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She turned the page to find more photos of them, the same woman appearing at different family events, always standing beside Yusef, her arm draped around him. Her breath caught in her throat. Who was this woman? Emily's mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman looked so familiar, like she belonged to Yusef's world in a way Emily couldn't. There were no signs of tension, no indication that the woman had been an ex, nothing that would hint at a past life that Yusef had never spoken of. But there was something about the woman's gaze, something that made Emily feel unsettled. It was as if the woman was looking at Yusef with a possessiveness that wasn't just from the past. Emily couldn't stop herself. She kept flipping through the album, each picture drawing her deeper into a world she hadn't known existed. And then, In a hidden corner of the album, there was a wedding photo. It was a picture of Youssef, standing next to the woman, his arm around her waist, both of them dressed in wedding attire, smiling like nothing could break them apart. Emily's mind reeled. A wedding. Youssef had been married before. He had never mentioned it, not once. Her fingers trembled as she closed the album, the weight of the truth settling in her stomach like a stone. She couldn't just let this go. The questions bubbled to the surface, demanding answers. She needed to know more. Emily's mind was clouded with confusion and anger. Why had Youssef kept this from her? What else was he hiding? That evening, when Youssef returned, Emily confronted him. The words came out in a rush, a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Youssef, why didn't you tell me you were married before?" she asked, her voice trembling. She held the album in her hands, her fingers gripping the edges tightly, the pages still fresh in her memory. Youssef froze, his expression momentarily betraying a flicker of surprise, but he quickly masked it with a practiced calm. "It was a long time ago, Emily," he said, his voice smooth, his gaze steady. "It wasn't something I thought was important to share." Emily's heart pounded as she looked at him. "How could you not think it was important? I found a photo of you, married. Why didn't you tell me? What else are you hiding?" Youssef's expression hardened, and he took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "I don't need to explain my past to you," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "What matters is the present, Emily, our future." But the words didn't sit right with her. His past was a part of him, a part of their life together now. Emily had never been the type to back down when something didn't sit right, and this was no different. She felt betrayed, not just by the omission, but by the way Youssef tried to brush it off, as if it didn't matter. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to know who you really are, Youssef. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when I know you've been hiding things from me." For a moment there was silence between them, thick with unspoken words. Youssef's face remained impassive, but the tension in his eyes spoke volumes. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm not proud of my past, Emily," he said, "but I've moved on. I've changed. And I need you to trust me." The words were soothing, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She had wanted the truth, but now that she had a glimpse, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether the ground beneath her was solid or about to crumble away. The evening ended in silence, the air between them thick with unanswered questions. Emily's mind raced as she lay in bed that night, the image of Youssef's wedding photo haunting her. How many more secrets was he hiding, and what did it mean for their future? The tension in the house had reached a point where it felt suffocating. Emily couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong, something deeper than the surface of Youssef's world that she couldn't see yet, but she could feel it in her bones. She had uncovered part of his past, the secrets of his previous marriage, and the woman who had been part of his life before her. But that discovery had opened a door to a darker, more unsettling possibility. What if Youssef wasn't the man she thought he was? What if everything, the luxurious lifestyle, the grand promises, the sweet words, was just a carefully crafted illusion? Youssef's demeanor had changed since their conversation. At first, he had tried to placate her with gentle reassurances, but now he seemed colder, more distant. She found herself walking on eggshells, unsure of what to say or what not to say. He had once been a source of comfort and security, but now he felt like a stranger. The more Emily thought about it, the more she began to question everything. She had thought she understood Youssef, his ambitions, his desires, his love for her. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't seeing, something he was hiding from her. It wasn't just the secrets of his past. It was something much more sinister, something in the present, something she couldn't yet grasp. One evening, as Youssef prepared for another high society event, Emily found herself alone in his study. Her curiosity, mixed with the growing sense of unease, led her to the desk where his files were neatly organized. She had never snooped before, but the doubt was gnawing at her. She needed answers, she told herself. She needed to understand why she felt so trapped. As she opened the drawer, she found nothing unusual at first, just paperwork, contracts, a few receipts, but then her eyes fell on a thick folder, bound in black leather. It wasn't labeled, but something about it caught her attention. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, but the desire for the truth was overpowering. Opening the folder, Emily's gaze quickly scanned the documents. Most of it was in Arabic, but there were a few English papers mixed in. One in particular stood out. It was a contract, an agreement of sorts. Emily's eyes narrowed as she read the title, Partnership Agreement. She flipped through the pages, her mind racing. There were references to properties, investments, and something about a business deal. But what really made her stomach drop was the last page. There in fine print was the name of an offshore company that Youssef had set up, linked to several shady transactions. The deals seemed legitimate on the surface, but there was a darker undertone. They weren't just about business. There were illegal implications, money laundering. And the more Emily read, the more she realized that Youssef's empire was built on something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat back in the chair, the folder still in her hands. Everything she had known about him, everything she had trusted, felt like it was slipping away. How could he have kept this from her? How could he hide something this big, this dangerous, and still expect her to believe that their life together was based on love? The silence of the room pressed in on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls, once filled with promises and security, felt like they were closing in around her. Youssef had built this perfect image for her, this life that seemed so pristine, so ideal. But behind the polished exterior was a labyrinth of lies, and now she was standing at the center of it. Emily? The sound of his voice broke through her thoughts. She quickly shoved the folder back into the drawer, her pulse racing. Youssef stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, trying to calm the anxiety bubbling inside her. He stepped inside, his gaze flicking over her, studying her reaction with careful scrutiny. "I thought you'd be getting ready for dinner," he said, his tone cold, but not unkind. "You know how important tonight is." Emily nodded, though the last thing she wanted was to attend another one of these parties. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to, something that could never be undone. "I'll be ready in a minute," she replied, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too strained. She needed time to think, to process what she had learned. But Youssef didn't leave. He stood there, watching her with that unsettling gaze, as though he knew exactly what was going through her mind. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying that undercurrent of authority. Emily felt the pressure building in her chest. Should she confront him now? Should she ask him about the papers, about the secrets she had just uncovered? The fear of his reaction, of what might happen if she pushed too far, held her back. She wasn't sure she was ready for the truth, but the weight of it all was unbearable. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Long day." Youssef didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he walked toward her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face in a tender gesture. For a brief moment, Emily wanted to believe that everything was still as it had been, that Youssef still loved her, still cared for her. But the truth, the hidden truths, lingered like a shadow between them. As he turned to leave, Emily's heart raced with the realization that she had crossed a line. She couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't unsee what she had just discovered, and the most terrifying thought of all, she didn't know what it meant for her future with Youssef. The night felt heavier than usual. Emily sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of Youssef's presence pressing down on her. His demands, the control, the secrets, it had all become too much, and yet the longer she stayed, the harder it seemed to leave. But she knew she couldn't stay in this gilded cage any longer. The life Youssef had built for her, the promises of love and security, had all been nothing more than a trap. She had seen the truth, and there was no going back. Emily's thoughts kept racing back to the documents she had found in his study. Proof of the dark dealings he had kept hidden from her. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, the business deals that tied him to corruption and crime. It had all come crashing down on her in an instant. She wasn't just married to a man who held power in his world. She was married to someone whose empire was built on lies. And now, she had to escape. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no more time to waste. Emily knew that if she stayed much longer, if she allowed Youssef to continue to manipulate her, she might never get out. She had to leave. But how? Emily's heart beat faster as she reached for her phone, unlocking it with shaking hands. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of who to trust. But then her mind settled on Lena, her lawyer, her friend. Lena had always been there for her, even when she didn't know she needed help. Emily had confided in her about some of the cracks in her marriage, though not everything. But tonight, there was no room for secrets. With a quick text, she sent Lena a message. "I need your help. I can't stay here anymore. Please, let's talk." She hit send, the action feeling like the first breath of air after being submerged underwater. Emily leaned back into the couch, her mind running wild. She thought of all the things she'd have to leave behind, the house, the luxury, the life she'd once dreamed of. But those things meant nothing now. They were nothing more than symbols of control, of a life that had been dictated to her. Minutes passed like hours. Emily's anxiety spiked with each passing second, wondering if Lena would respond, if she would be able to help her get out of this nightmare. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. It was Lena. "I'm coming over. Stay calm. We'll figure this out." Relief washed over Emily, but it was quickly replaced by fear. She couldn't go back to the life she had been living, but how could she leave without Yusef finding out? He was always watching, always in control. The sound of the front door opening broke her thoughts. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned off her phone. Yusef stepped into the room, his usual confident stride filling the space. His eyes met hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. "Everything okay?" Emily smiled, but the expression felt forced, like a mask she had to wear to protect herself. "Of course, just a long day." Yusef nodded, his gaze lingering on her, as though trying to read her. Emily met his stare, her stomach twisting. She had become so used to this constant tension, this need to maintain the appearance of a perfect wife, even when everything inside her screamed to escape. He stepped closer, and for a moment Emily thought he might sense something was off, but instead he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but only made her feel more trapped. "You're not alone in this, Emily," he said, his tone almost too gentle. "I'm doing this for us, for our future." Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the control, the way he had manipulated her into believing that this life was the only option. She had to get out. "I'm going to bed," she said, standing up quickly. "I'm really tired, Yusef." He seemed to sense the change in her energy, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is everything okay?" His voice softened as if trying to reach her. "You're acting distant." "I'm fine," Emily replied, forcing a smile. "Just need some time to think." Yusef hesitated for a moment before nodding, his expression unreadable. "Okay, we'll talk later." As she walked away, Emily's mind raced. She had to make her move, and Lena would be the key to helping her escape before it was too late. A few hours later, Emily stood in the kitchen pacing back and forth, waiting for Lena to arrive. Her heart was pounding in her chest. The plan had to be perfect. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled her. Emily rushed to the door, opening it just as Lena stepped out of her car, her face set with determination. "We need to move quickly," Lena said, her voice low but urgent. "I've been working on a plan. I've got contacts who can help, but we can't waste any more time. Are you ready?" Emily nodded, her hands trembling. This was it. She was about to make the hardest decision of her life, but it was the only choice left. She couldn't stay in a marriage that had become a prison. Together, they walked out into the night, the weight of the world on Emily's shoulders, but for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. The escape had begun. The night was heavy with anticipation, a thick fog of tension clouding every corner of the mansion. Emily stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, her heart racing. The time had come. She could feel the weight of it. Everything was about to change. The escape plan was in motion, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Yusef was watching her, sensing something was off. He had become distant in the past few days, but there was an edge to his behavior that made her uneasy. His silence, his piercing gaze, it was as if he could see through her every move. And now, tonight, Emily knew she couldn't keep running from the truth any longer. She had to face him. Yusef entered the room without a word, his presence looming in the doorway. The door clicked shut behind him with finality. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face him, her breath shallow. She hadn't expected this confrontation to happen so soon. "Emily?" Yusef's voice broke the silence, cool and controlled. "I know something's wrong. What's going on?" Her pulse quickened. There was no point in pretending anymore. She had seen the man he truly was, and she could no longer ignore the lies and the hidden truths that had been creeping into their life together. She swallowed hard, her eyes not leaving his. "I know about your past, Yusef. I know about your first marriage. I know about the business deals, the offshore accounts. Everything." Yusef's face remained expressionless, but his eyes darkened. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "How did you find out?" His voice was low, almost a growl, but Emily didn't flinch. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "I found the photo album," she said, her voice shaking slightly but still firm. "And the documents in your study. I know about the things you've been hiding from me, about the lies, the illegal dealings, everything." Yusef's jaw clenched, and for a split second Emily saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. A flash of anger, then something darker, almost calculating. "You shouldn't have looked, Emily," he said, his tone cold, but still controlled. "I warned you before that my past was not something I wanted to share. It's not important." "Not important?" Emily's voice rose, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You've built your entire life on lies, Yusef. You've manipulated me, controlled me, and now you want to say it's not important?" Yusef took a step toward her, his presence overpowering, but Emily didn't back down. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. She couldn't let him intimidate her anymore. "You knew from the beginning that I had a past, Emily," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "A past I'm not proud of, but I've changed. I've built this life for us, for you, don't you see that?" Emily shook her head, the words catching in her throat. "No, Yusef, you've built a cage for me. I've been living in it without even realizing it. I've been living your dream, not my own." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, but Emily flinched, pulling away. "You don't get to do that to me anymore," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not your possession. I'm not your accessory. I'm not some perfect image you can mold into whatever you want." Yusef's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Emily thought he might lash out, but instead his expression softened, the anger giving way to something else, something colder. He took a step back, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't understand," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "This life, everything I've done, it's all for you. I want you to be part of it, to be by my side. You have everything now, Emily. You don't need to worry about anything, just trust me." Emily's heart twisted at his words, but she knew they were nothing more than another attempt to control her. He was still trying to make her believe that this life, this cage, was something she should want. But she couldn't. Not anymore. "I can't live like this anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't pretend that everything is fine. I can't keep living in a world that isn't mine. I've lost myself in you, Yusef, and I'm done." For a moment there was silence again, the weight of her words sinking in. Yusef stared at her, his face unreadable, and Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't know what would happen next. Would he let her go? Would he fight for her? Finally he spoke, his voice low and quiet. "If you leave, Emily, you will have nothing. I will make sure of it." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had already made her decision. She had to leave, no matter the consequences. "I'll have my freedom," she said, her voice steady. "And that's more than enough." Yusef didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked out of the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Emily stood there, her breath coming in shallow bursts, her heart still pounding. She had said the words she needed to say, and now there was no turning back. The days after the confrontation had been a blur of anxiety and fear. Emily could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her with each passing moment. Yusef had been distant, but there was a quiet tension between them that seemed to grow thicker with every day. He didn't push her, didn't ask questions. He simply watched. And Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he knew she was planning to leave. The cracks in their marriage, the ones she had tried to ignore for so long, had grown wide enough to swallow her whole. Yusef's control over her was suffocating. He had manipulated her, built a life around lies, and she couldn't pretend any longer that this was the future she wanted. But just when Emily thought she was free, the final betrayal came, harder and more crushing than she could have imagined. It was late one night, the house unusually quiet as Emily sat in the living room. The dim light from the fireplace flickered, casting shadows across the room. She was lost in her thoughts, her phone in her hand, texting Lena with the final details of her escape plan. The text had been quick, full of urgency, as Lena prepared to help her slip out without anyone noticing, but the quiet was shattered when Yusef walked in, his steps deliberate and heavy on the hardwood floor. "Emily," he said, his voice sharp, a tone she had not heard in weeks. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. She had hoped that by now he would have accepted her decision, but the look in his eyes, cold, calculating, told her everything she needed to know. He didn't wait for her response. He moved toward her, his presence commanding, suffocating. He sat down beside her, too close, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think I didn't notice?" His voice was low, almost a growl, but it sent a chill through her. "You think I didn't see it? The way you've been slipping away? The late nights, the secret messages? The change in your demeanor?" Emily froze. He knew. She had no words left. The truth was out, hanging in the air between them like a dense fog. Her body tensed, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. How much longer could she keep up this charade? How much longer could she pretend to live in a marriage that had become a prison? "I wasn't hiding anything from you," Emily said, her voice trembling but steady. She wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself. I can't keep living like this." Yusef's lips twisted into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "I know you've been planning to leave. I know you've been getting help." Emily's heart raced. She had been so careful, so cautious. How had he found out? Was there someone she could trust anymore? "I never wanted this," Yusef continued, his voice turning icy. "But if you think you can just walk away from everything, our life, our future, then you're gravely mistaken." His words felt like a slap, but they didn't sting the way they used to. She had already decided. She had to leave. But then, just as she thought the worst was over, Yusef's tone shifted. "There's one more thing you need to know, Emily. A little truth that I've been keeping from you. It's not just me who's been watching you." Her blood ran cold. She looked up, confusion and fear washing over her. "What are you talking about? You think you're going to escape?" His smile now was one of cruel amusement. "You think you can just walk out and leave all of this behind? I've already arranged for you to be watched. The people I work with, they will be keeping an eye on you." The air around Emily felt like it had thickened, pressing in on her chest. The room seemed to close in. Her escape plan, her hopes for freedom, were shattered in a single, devastating sentence. "I've made sure you won't get far," Yusef said, his voice now soft, almost affectionate. But there was no warmth in it, only the coldness of a man who had decided he wasn't going to let her go. "You'll never escape, Emily. You're mine." Tears sprang to her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to be strong. She couldn't let him see her fear, couldn't let him win, but deep inside a part of her crumbled. The wall she had been trying to break free from had only grown higher, the bars on her cage stronger. Yusef had made sure of it. She was trapped. Emily stood up, her body trembling. "You can't control me forever, Yusef." His gaze darkened, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, or was it frustration? "You'll learn, Emily, the hard way, but you won't leave me. Not now. Not ever." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, each step feeling like a betrayal of everything she had wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of a fight she couldn't afford to lose. Emily stood by the window, her fingers pressed against the cool glass, staring out into the night. The house was quiet, too quiet. Yusef had gone to sleep hours ago, but Emily couldn't bring herself to rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something in the air was shifting. She knew it was now or never. Lena's message had come through that afternoon. "Everything is set. You're not alone in this. We'll get you out." But even with the plan in place, Emily's mind raced with doubts. Every time she thought about leaving, about running from the life she had built with Yusef, she felt a pang of fear. But she also felt something else, something stronger, determination. She had finally understood that she couldn't stay. Yusef's manipulation, his lies, his control, it was suffocating her, breaking her down. The more she discovered, the more she realized that there was no way out, no way to change the course of this marriage unless she took matters into her own hands. The clock on the wall ticked louder, and Emily's pulse quickened. She couldn't let herself hesitate. If she did, Yusef would make sure she stayed. She would be trapped forever. With a shaky breath, she turned away from the window and grabbed the bag she had packed in secret. The small essentials, clothes, money, her passport, everything she could carry without drawing attention. She had planned this escape down to the smallest detail, but the hardest part was still ahead of her. She had to leave without Yusef knowing, without alerting anyone to her departure. As she moved toward the door, she heard a noise, soft, almost imperceptible. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? She paused, her breath held, waiting to see if he would come through the door. But nothing. The house remained still, eerily quiet. She took another step, then another, her body trembling with fear and excitement as she reached for the door handle. She had to be quick. If she was caught now, everything she had planned would fall apart. Just as she was about to step out, she heard a sound, a door creaking open followed by soft footsteps. Panic surged through her. and she spun around. There, standing in the hallway, was Yusef. His face was expressionless, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm, too calm. It sent a chill down her spine. He had been waiting for this moment. He knew. Emily's mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. She hadn't planned for this. "I was just getting some fresh air." Yusef took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You're lying, Emily. I know what you've been doing. I know what you've been planning." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Emily's heart pounded and she fought to keep her composure. This was it. She had no choice but to face him, to confront the truth. There was no going back now. "I can't do this anymore," Emily said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't stay in this marriage. I can't live this life, Yusef. You've been hiding things from me. You've been controlling me. I've lost myself in all of this." Yusef's expression darkened, his lips tightening. For a moment there was silence. Then his face softened, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Emily, you're making a mistake. You don't know what you're throwing away. I've given you everything. I've given you security, a future." "But it's not my future," Emily shouted, stepping back. "This was never my choice. It's all been your life, your world, your rules. I've lost who I am." Yusef's gaze flickered with something darker, something colder. "You don't understand. You're not just my wife. You're part of everything I've built. You're mine. I won't let you walk away." The finality in his words hit her like a punch. He wasn't just angry. He was threatening her. And for the first time, Emily realized how deep his control ran. "No, Yusef," she said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "I'm not yours. I'm my own person. I'm leaving." Before he could react, Emily turned quickly, pushing past him and running toward the door. Her heart was racing, adrenaline surging through her body. She had to make it. She had to leave before he could stop her. Yusef didn't chase after her immediately. For a split second, Emily thought she might actually make it. But then she heard his voice, low, threatening. "If you leave, Emily, you will have nothing. I'll make sure of it." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then the door was open, and she was out in the cool night air. The world felt different, like she was stepping into a new life, one where she would have control. The car waiting for her was already there, Lena behind the wheel, her face set with determination. Without a word, Emily climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking. She looked back at the mansion one last time, the place that had been her prison, now behind her. As they drove away, Emily's heart slowly began to settle. She didn't know where she would go from here, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. She had escaped the trap, and she wasn't going to look back. Emily sat quietly in the small apartment, the world outside buzzing with life, but inside, everything felt still. She had never imagined herself here, on her own, in a place that wasn't opulent, wasn't grand, wasn't controlled by someone else's expectations. And yet, as the silence enveloped her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The apartment was modest, but it was hers. She had picked every detail, the simple furniture, the white walls, the sunlight that filtered through the window each morning. There were no reminders of the man she had left behind, no suffocating luxuries or hidden threats. It was just her, and for the first time in so long she felt a flicker of hope. The phone buzzed on the small table in front of her. Lena's name flashed on the screen, and Emily's heart tightened with both gratitude and a touch of nervousness. She had stayed with Lena for a few days after she'd left Yusef, the escape a blurry mix of fear and exhilaration. Lena had offered her support, helping her contact a lawyer and start the process of cutting all ties with Yusef. But even with everything settled, there was still so much left to confront. Emily picked up the phone, her fingers shaking slightly. "Hey, Lena," she said, her voice stronger now, though still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" Lena's voice was warm, concerned, but Emily could hear the hint of pride in her tone as well. "You're doing great, Em. I know this isn't easy, but you're free now. You've made it." Emily took a deep breath. "It doesn't feel real yet. I keep waiting for Yusef to show up or for someone to remind me that I've made a huge mistake. I keep wondering if I've done the right thing." Lena's laugh was gentle, reassuring. "Of course you did. You're safe now, Emily. You've escaped a life that wasn't yours. That's the only thing that matters." There was a long pause, and Emily's gaze drifted to the window, to the new life she was building. The truth was, she was scared. She was scared of being alone, of facing the world without Yusef's wealth or the life she had once thought she wanted. The sense of safety he had promised, the facade of love, had been ripped away. But underneath the fear was something else, a realization that she had the power to choose, to live life on her own terms. "I don't know who I am anymore, Lena," Emily confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I thought I knew about myself was tied to him. I don't know where to start." "You start with you," Lena replied softly, but firmly. "You've already done the hardest part. You walked away. Now you take it one day at a time. Build yourself back up, piece by piece. And don't be afraid to ask for help. You're not alone." Emily's eyes stung with unshed tears, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. She felt a shift within herself, like a burden lifting, like something old and heavy was finally letting go. "Thanks, Lena," she whispered, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I'll figure it out." And she would. Emily knew that her journey wasn't over, that there would be days when the past would come crashing back, reminding her of the pain and betrayal she had suffered. But in that moment, as the weight of the past finally began to fade, Emily knew she was stronger than she had ever realized. She was free. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was living in someone else's world. She felt like she was living in her own. She ended the call with Lena and set the phone down, a small, victorious smile tugging at her lips. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Emily was no longer defined by Youssef, by his world, or by the lies he had woven around her. She was a woman who had found her strength again, who had escaped a life that was never truly hers, and who was now ready to build something real. She stood up from the couch, walked over to the small table by the window, and picked up a pen and a notebook. She opened to the first page, staring at the blank sheet. For the first time in a long time, the possibilities felt endless. It was her turn to write her own story. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, the city lights outside casting a soft glow through the window. The apartment was quiet, peaceful, her sanctuary. She had lived in this small space for 2 weeks now, and every day had been an exercise in reclaiming herself. There were days when the fear would creep back in, when the memories of Youssef's control felt too fresh, too heavy. But slowly, with each passing day, she felt something shift inside of her. The weight of the past was no longer suffocating her. Instead, she was beginning to breathe again. The door to her apartment opened with a soft click. Lena entered, carrying a bag of groceries and a smile that radiated warmth. "Hey," Lena greeted, setting the bag down. "How's it going today?" Emily stood and walked over to greet her friend, hugging her tightly. The bond between them had grown stronger in the past couple of weeks, as Lena had been there every step of the way, providing support, helping her navigate the emotions of rebuilding her life from scratch. "I'm okay," Emily replied, pulling away from the hug. "I'm learning how to breathe again." Lena smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "You're doing more than just breathing. You're starting to live again, Emily. You're reclaiming your life." Emily nodded, the words sinking deep into her heart. She had come so far, so much farther than she ever thought she could, and yet there was still this lingering sense of uncertainty. What would her future look like? What path would she choose now that she was free? She picked up her phone and checked the message from her lawyer. "The paperwork is almost ready. You're free to do whatever you want now, Emily. No more ties, no more chains." The words on the screen brought a lump to her throat. She had done it. She had finally cut the ties that bound her to the man who had controlled every aspect of her life. She had walked away from a gilded cage, and now she was free. Lena watched her closely, sensing the shift in her emotions. "What's going through your mind?" she asked softly. Emily looked up, a mix of fear and excitement in her eyes. "I don't know. I think I'm still waiting for something to go wrong. I keep thinking that any minute now Youssef will show up and try to convince me that I made a mistake, that I can't live without him." Lena shook her head, her expression firm. "That's not who you are anymore, Emily. You've already made the hardest decision, and you've taken control of your life. Youssef's world doesn't own you anymore." Emily smiled, feeling the truth in Lena's words. Youssef's hold on her had been powerful, yes, but now it felt so distant, like a shadow from a past life. She was no longer that woman, no longer the one who had allowed herself to be defined by his rules, by his world. "I think I'm scared," Emily admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "Scared of what comes next. Scared that I won't be strong enough to build a life on my own." Lena stepped forward, taking Emily's hands in hers. "You've already built something, Emily. You've built your freedom. That's more than a lot of people can say. The rest will come, piece by piece. You just have to trust yourself." Emily took a deep breath, absorbing Lena's words. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where she would go or what she would do. But one thing was clear: she was no longer living in fear. She was no longer shackled by the past. She was free to write her own story. As Lena began unpacking the groceries, Emily wandered over to the small table by the window. She picked up her journal, something she had kept hidden for years, the pages filled with the words of a woman she barely recognized. But now, as she flipped through the pages, she saw something else. She saw a woman who had dreamed of freedom, who had dreamed of a life that was entirely her own. The words on the pages were no longer just memories. They were her foundation. She picked up the pen, her hand steady, and began to write, "I am free. I am mine, and I will create the life I deserve." The pen moved across the paper, fluid and sure. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was in control. She was no longer a prisoner of someone else's dream. She was free to live her own. The future was wide open, and though she didn't have all the answers, Emily knew one thing for sure: she was no longer afraid. She was ready to embrace whatever came next. What do you think of Emily's journey and her decision to break free? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score for her courage and resilience? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow all our stories. And if you're looking for more heartwarming tales, click here on the end screen to check out our other videos.